oftentimes like changing how somebody runs is just one of the more difficult things to do because you're changing a behavior they've had imprinted for however many years, it could be decades in an older adult. Like a lot of times for those people, because they're not trying to do things at a very high level, doing, general strengthening or mobility work, or like soft tissue work, manual therapy, I might be able to get them to achieve their goal without messing with how they run. And there's just easier ways to get them from point A to point B. So in that instance, I'm not going to look at technique or try to mess with how they execute the task. So again, the answer is always, it depends, but hopefully those two examples provide maybe some context as to when you might want to tinker with how somebody moves. But the other piece is, especially like when I work with people in a medical setting, and this applies to medical and performance, like when we see, there's this whole thing, where we talk about like self-organization, and there's this idea, I'm not saying everybody thinks this, but there is a narrative sometimes that, that snapshot of how you're seeing somebody move and that self-organization, that like that is necessarily optimal because that's the strategy that somebody came up with organically. But I don't think we should assume that because somebody derived at a solution organically, that it's necessarily the best solution. Because a lot of times people, before they work with any of us, they've had previous coaching, and we can't assume that previous coaching was always good. Like people don't grow up or develop in like an informational vacuum. Like they've had people telling them what to do, and how they've been told or what they've been told to do may not be good. It may be good or bad, right? So you've got to tease out like, well, and I see this a lot with even like, team sport athletes, like when they accelerate and you watch them accelerate and they're like folding at the hips, and you're kind of like, why are you doing that? Or what did somebody tell you to do when you accelerate? And it's like, oh, well, my coach always tells me to stay low when I accelerate. And even though I understand the intent of that cue, but if they're folding at the hips when they do it, like that's actually, if you assume that they self-organize and that's like the optimal technique because that's what they did the first time, and you don't tease out how they got there, like maybe that's not the best solution or the optimal solution. And the other piece is a lot of times people arrive at a solution to a task, not because it's the best solution, but because they've arrived there out of necessity because they don't have movement options. So like, let's take an example of someone when they're running after an ACL injury, right? Like an ACL surgery. If you don't restore someone's knee flexion after an ACL surgery, and then you're seeing them 6 months later, or someone else sees them 6 months later and they watch them run and they have a low heel recovery, like that's not necessarily because a low heel recovery is the optimal solution and it's organic and they self-organized. They don't have knee flexion. Like that movement is not available to them. So they have no choice but to run with a low heel recovery. So, as a physical therapist, as a strength coach, some of the things that we can do is like, we can make sure that people have adequate movement options so that now when they go perform a task, they actually like have a choice as to what to do. And they're not constrained by, lack of range of motion at a joint. So that's where it gets complicated because like, I don't look at people and necessarily like try to optimize them and say like, you're doing everything wrong, you don't move well. But I do want to make sure that like, I do an assessment to assure that they have movement options available to them. And that could even include strength, right? I mean, maybe if you watch somebody run or change direction and you don't like, the projection angle when they accelerate or they cut, it might not be a matter of like you cueing them out of it. If they are not strong enough eccentrically to control those positions, then no matter what you tell them, that's not going to get better until they have that strength available to them. In the case of the runner with a low heel recovery, if they don't have knee flexion, they're not going to have a high heel recovery or an adequate heel recovery that, or that you deem adequate, right? So I think that what our job is, because we're not sport coaches, right? But we're technique coaches per se. But if we can ensure that people have good GPP, good, whether it's like a good base of mobility, strength, elasticity, now when somebody plays a sport, at least they have options available to them. And then when they self-organize, it's kind of more of a choice and not so much something that they're constrained to do out of necessity because they have limited options available to them. So even though the answer is it depends, hopefully that provides a little bit more clarity as to like how you might look at the whole movement quality strategy thing versus just like saying, well, it's organic, we should just leave them alone.